Perfect. So I think we're live. Welcome to today's lunch hour on the European Parliament elections. What's next? My name is Jannike Wachowiak, and I'm a researcher at the UKICE Changing Europe. And for today's discussion, I'm being joined by an excellent panel. So we have Sophia Russack, who's a researcher in the Institutions Unit at CEPS, which is the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Sophia was also part of the Franco-German group of experts that recently published a paper on EU institutional reform, and she focuses on the European Parliament elections, the Spitzenkandidaten process, and lots of topics that are going to be really relevant for our discussion today. So thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Eddy Wax, who's the co-author of the POLITICO Brussels playbook. And in the lead up to the EP elections, Eddy kept us informed about every twist and turn in the European Parliament election campaigns in his weekly EU election playbook. And last but not least, we're also joined by Stephanie Luke, who is currently a researcher at the UKICE Changing Europe, and also works on a grant on reporting on the general election here in the UK, and teaches a political geography module at the University of Sheffield. So yeah, a stellar panel for our discussion today. To those in the audience, you can pop any questions you may have into the Slido throughout the discussion. Please keep them short if you can, to make my job a little bit easier. And you can also vote for the questions you find the most interesting, so that I'll be able to post the ones that the audience finds the most relevant. So I want to dive straight in. The headline before the European Parliament elections was the expected rise of the far right. And far-right parties did indeed increase their vote share with some high-profile wins in France and in Germany. But at the same time, they underperformed in other places, like, for example, the Nordics. So my first question to the panel, to all three of you, is what does this election tell us about the state of the far right in Europe? And how much power do you think these parties will actually hold in the European Parliament? Sophia, do you maybe want to kick us off? And then Steph, and then Eddy?
Sure. Well, look, I think what is important is that, first of all, it is not a search. Now, we talked about it a lot, and a lot of commentators talked about a search, and this is not what we see. And this was also foreseeable that we won't see a search. It's a steady increase in right-wing forces in the European Parliament, and that is also very dangerous. But I think we need the right framing to kind of, put our attention on, the real issue here. We have a steady increase of right-wing forces of the last 20, if not 30 years. And now we're looking at around, 24% of lawmakers that sit to the right of the EPP. Now, what effect will this have? By the way, last time it was around 22, right? So we're talking, not more than 2%, actually. Again, in total, it's a lot and too much, but the increase is not a surge. Now, when it comes to, decision-making inside the European Parliament, then, not much will change because of these 2%. But what will change is the effects, or I think that is what we're going to see probably, the effects that those, parties will have on the mainstream. That is usually the biggest effect that, far-right parties have on the system, not by making decisions themselves or even blocking them, because again, you would need 50% of this in a parliament. But, it is very much about how they affect the mainstream and the center-right particularly, right? How will the EPP position themselves to this, I think, is a crucial question. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Steph, do you want to go next? How do you see the state of the far right after the elections?
Yeah, I'll try not to repeat that, because that was a lovely summary of I think what's going on. And yeah, just to repeat the fact that it isn't a surge. We had it in 2019 in the run-up. It was saying, the far right are going to do well, and they do well, but it's sort of, you've got to look at it in the scheme of everything else. And there is a long-term trend that there is increasing support for these parties at both European and national level. It's not like a unique thing that's happened at the European level. But I would say that it is very much how they influence these centre-right parties in particular, and the fact that the language that they use is very much being adopted by the centre right, and that's sort of their influence. So I would very much say it's sort of more maybe it's like, yes, electoral success is great, but it's their influence they have on the language and policies that are really important to how like the future of the European Parliament is going to happen in the next few years or so.
Thanks. And Eddy, I guess you're a journalist, and the headline before the election in lots of the media coverage was, far right surge, rise of the far right. Now, after the election, what is your main kind of key takeaway or your main headline?
Well, I also find it annoying personally when academics and other parts of society just always blame the media, and I think that's a convenient way of I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I have, a lot of the commentary in the academic community is the media overhyped this, and look how foolish they were, and look how dangerous even they were, and I think that's nonsense, because maybe it's not a surge or whatever term we want to put on it, but certainly, look at what's happening in France, and nobody should be underestimating the severity of what's happening there. And it may be that the impact of this election in the European Parliament is not felt immediately, but ultimately the European Parliament is only one element of the EU. And if France, falls to the far right, then, the whole of the European Union will be massively affected. Even if Jordan Bardella is Prime Minister of France, in a month's time, the whole EU is going to be shaken to the absolute core. So we shouldn't underestimate it. And that would be a surge. That would be a massive surge. And especially looking forward to 2027 when, there's a French presidential battle as well. I think another element of it that's interesting is that the EPP sees itself as a kind of check on the surge. It credits itself as holding back some of the more far right urges of the parties to its right, and in some ways you could say that strategy is working. I mean, they are taming Fiala, they are taming Meloni, if you believe what they say, and that is one of the major factors, that the pull of attraction, the magnetic force of the EPP. Being the largest group and having lots of money and prestige and being a respectable force and basically the leading force in the EU, is perhaps something that's stopping the formation of this massive supergroup on the far right, which will be bad for the EPP, will be bad for the S&D, the centrists, the liberals. So that's another thing to bear in mind, I think.
Jannike, respond?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Eddy, you're right, but I don't think it's only the media. I'm also, I think I see this in the think tank community and the academic community equally, right? I think it's generally an issue of reporting. And what I think is the issue, if we expect a surge and it's not coming, we're just like relieved. And we do not put attention on the fact that there is a problem. It's a bit of proverbial frog in the hot water, but we don't expect, if we expect something else that actually comes, like we're all happy for the next 5 years and thinking, okay, it's all fine. But it is 1/4 of MEPs on the right of the EPP that is an issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that it's a changes the game, but I think I'm not going to defend all journalists, because I think a lot of what they write is utter crap. But from our own reporting, I mean, we did play up the threat of the far right, because that was, and justifiably so, one of the major themes of this campaign. And I think that the fact is that we were right to do that. Look at Austria, where the FPÖ is first. Look at the Netherlands, where, according to depending on how you slice the cake, the far right either came second or came first, depending on how you calculate the seats in the European Parliament. Look at France, look at Italy, and look at all the different governments. Sweden, where the far right is propping up the government. Finland, where the hard right nationalists are in the government. So it's certainly a theme. I just think that from Politico's reporting track record, I mean, we were never saying that the EU was about to get taken over, that Jordan Bardella would be kicking out von der Leyen from the Commission presidency or something like that. We were always very clear that what the far right is aiming to do is to kind of block legislation, have enough, have enough seats to be able to put a handbrake on green legislation, on migration laws, and basically to be an obstacle to the legislative process, and ultimately to have more seats around the European Council table where they really can influence things. And last thing I'll say is that, when we were starting to write about this in sort of February, the prospect of Geert Wilders sitting around that European Council table was still there. It was only really in the last stages of the campaign across the European level that we realized, okay, he's not going to be prime minister. But I think we've always been clear that the influence of the far right is more about soft power. It's more about, as you said at the beginning, like pulling right-wing parties towards them, like what we're seeing in France and Les Républicains.
Thank you. I think, it would be great to drill down a bit more into kind of the question of how influential the far right is going to be in this European Parliament. Like we've heard from Sophia, 24% of lawmakers in the EP are going to be from the far right. And I guess another kind of headline or conventional wisdom before the election was that the far right at European level is too fragmented and too disorganized to have a real impact. And we know that they're currently split into Marine Le Pen's Identity and Democracy group, and then Meloni's European Conservatives and Reformists. And there's, of course, a large number of currently unaffiliated MEPs, and it's kind of still unclear where some of them will go. So I guess my first question would be, do you think there are any reasons to believe that the far right will be more organized in the new European Parliament, or are we going to continue to see fragmentation and kind of an inability on behalf of the far right to be more cohesive? Steph, do you maybe want to kick us off on this one?
So, I mean, the thing is, they have similar things in common, and they always have done. So whether it's reforming the EU from within, sovereignty back to member states, having more restrictive immigration policies, they do agree on these fundamentals. However, there is a lot of disagreement on other areas, like Ukraine, for example. And I mean, the disagreements are still going to be there. And I think, if you've got like the ECR trying to be more moderate, trying to like appeal to the EPP, to work with them. And then you've got ID with Marine Le Pen, and she's still very much excluded from any supposed cooperation because, in the eyes of von der Leyen, she's not like perceived as being pro-European like Meloni's ECR. And I think it's very much, they won't be able to form a united group, but they don't need to. This is the thing, they have these concrete issues that they do agree on. And like, if you look at like the European Green Deal, they do oppose it. So I think it's very much about like sort of the fact that they don't actually need this. Obviously it would, it would help them a lot if they had a number of seats, but it won't necessarily mean that they would agree on everything. And this is the thing, it's a challenge for them to actually try and sort of unite on one issue, let alone many. So I think it's very much about issues and what come up and how they can influence in that sense. And forming a group, I don't think is realistic. And Marine Le Pen is not necessarily going to make a decision about the AfD and whether they can come back until after the French elections, because they very much want to be separate from the AfD. So I think it's very much about like, them having issue-based alliances rather than actually forming like a united group.
Thank you. I think a bit later in the discussion, I'd like to go into a bit more detail on kind of issue-based alliances and what might happen to the policy agenda in the European Parliament. But for now, Eddy, what do you think will happen to the political groups in the European Parliament, and where will some of the non-affiliated MEPs go? We also have a question from the audience in the Slido about what our best guess is, what will happen to Orban's Fidesz party and where they will go. So maybe you want to try answering that question for us.
Well, I don't want to make guesses. That's not my job to make predictions, but I will make a prediction. I don't think at the moment that Orban is going to find a political home in the European Parliament. I just don't see that the ECR would want to take the risk of letting him in. I mean, with the whole thing about them trying to present themselves as respectable, you've got basically two prime ministers in that group at the moment, Petr Fiala in the Czech Republic and Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and they're both governing with EPP parties. So, you know, to then take in Orban, who is basically persona non grata for the EPP, would obviously make things tricky at the European Council. And numerically, I don't see that it would necessarily be in their benefit. I mean, I think Orban's maybe got 10 MEPs. You need to check that. Certainly, he's got less than the 13 he had before. So he's less attractive in terms of numbers. And we know how many parties have threatened to leave, you know, the NVA, the True Finns, the Sweden Democrats, the Latvians, so the Czechs. So you have all the small delegations jumping ship, and you could end up having the same numbers as before or even less. So I don't think it really makes sense on that front. That's why Orban really, I think, is one of the most fervent advocates for a supergroup, because, you know, that's a way for him to be in a group, but everyone would be in the group, so it wouldn't be a question of people having to make a tough decision about whether to accept him or not. I think the other big thing at the moment, I think I'll write about this in the playbook on Friday, not to give away my plans, but you know, it's the battle for third place, you know, because at the moment the EPP is only saying we want to talk to the S&D and Renew, but I think that was their plan, you know, from before. It's a very kind of conservative, no pun intended, sort of negotiating stance, because it doesn't include ECR or the Greens, which is the main, you know, choice that they face. Who do we bring in? But I think now when there's 100 MEPs who are basically we can't seat them anywhere at the moment, either because they're from a new party that's just come into the parliament, or you know, they are non-attached like Fidesz in Hungary. You know, with 100 of them knocking around, the game is on really, and there's all these conversations now happening. Manfred Weber of the EPP is going to be traveling to Hungary to talk to the sort of new opposition leader there on Friday. And all sorts of other conversations, but really it's about Renew and ECR and who can and ID as well. Who can they bring in? What can they offer to parties to join them? I mean, if I was a sort of far right MEP, I would be, and it's more about, you know, it's also about individual MEPs, and I would have, you know, if I was a far right MEP, I would be thinking maybe it's better to join ECR because then I'm not covered by the cordon sanitaire, and I can probably get a nice post somewhere, a nice fancy job. So yeah. That's the battle is on now for who can bring in the most members, and will that change the arithmetic in the European Parliament in terms of who's the biggest group or who's the third biggest group?
Sophia, what do you think? How organized is the far right going to be in this European Parliament?
Yeah, I agree to everything that Steph and Eddy have flagged. I think what we see at the moment is de facto more fragmentation, that the AfD has been kicked out, right? I mean, the fragmentation is real there. They will try to get back into the ID or establish their own group. And I have the feeling that, you know, more realistic might be rejoining ID, and that all depends on Le Pen, of course. Where I would have argued that, you know, she doesn't want them back because, you know, she eyes on the presidential elections in 3 years. But then, that being said, you know, with Macron calling snap elections, one could even argue she has achieved for now what she wanted, you know, and maybe she might be interested in getting these 14 and potentially again 15 seats that the AfD would bring back into the group. So I think rejoining the ID is not off the table here, but certainly, as Steph said, this is something for later. But no, I absolutely agree. The fragmentation is I don't see them more united. The only ones that would like to have a united one big group is indeed Orban and the ID. And for the ECR, I mean, I've heard the chairman saying it very clearly. There won't be a joint group of ID and ECR. So this is really off the table. That doesn't mean that they don't vote together, right? And make coalitions on a case-to-case basis throughout the term.
Thank you. I'd like to move on and talk a bit about the centrist parties. So we've talked quite a bit now about kind of how the far right is organized in the EP and whether we expect them to work together or not. But I guess kind of the other story of this election is that the grand coalition of the centre right, the centre left, and the Liberals was able to maintain its majority. We heard you're hearing a lot of people talking about the centre held, and one of the key takeaways seems to be that the pro-European centre holds. I guess my question to you would be, you still have quite a lot of variety of parties in this grand coalition. So does being pro-European mean the same for these parties? And how cohesive do you expect this grand coalition to be, particularly as there might be kind of some tensions between being pulled to the right, to working with the ECR, or to the left or to the Green side, particularly for the EPP. So yeah, how cohesive do you expect this coalition to be? Who wants to start? Maybe we go in reverse order, so start with Sophia.
Yeah, no, I think you flag an important point. Right now, they're united in their, especially the center-left parties, of course, in their, common mission against the far right. But when it comes to policy issues, these are, of course, very different. We see that within the EPP, the resistance against the next phase of the Green Deal is growing, to name only one example. I think this shows how crucial. I mean, if you look at the majorities, there will be basically hardly any decision be made without the EPP, right? This is what brings them in such a powerful position, because the left side of the spectrum, so that is the socialists, the Greens, liberals, and the left, they won't reach 50% anymore, which they did so far, right? And or they just reached 50%, and if then some from the non-attached, for instance, from the 5-star, if they voted with them, then we saw that in the last term they were this left coalition was responsible for a lot of the more progressive decisions made, and that I think that maybe even affect the policy agenda of the EU more than more right-wing MEPs, right? That on the left is slimmer, and the EPP is very powerful because they are needed in almost every constellation of decision-making, and the EPP might use this to play out its partners to the left and to the right.
Steph, do you want to comment on this, the cohesiveness of the grand coalition?
I mean, I can do, but I thought we were going in reverse order, so I was going for Eddy first, but I'm quite happy.
Fair enough. Let's go to Eddy first then.
So the question is, can you just repeat the question a bit more? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. So the question is basically, well, the center holds, and a lot of reporting or a lot of headlines are saying, well, the center is the centrist coalition is pro-European, but you still have quite a huge variety of parties in this grand coalition. So my question is, well, how cohesive are they actually going to be over the next 5 years? And does being pro-European mean the same for all of those, for all the parties in this grand coalition?
Well, they all have different visions of Europe, I suppose. The EPP would attack the Greens, saying that they haven't backed the major sort of pro-European laws like the Common Agricultural Policy or the Migration Pact. So they all have different ways of being pro-European, but the Greens would say, that we were doing this for the good of Europe. So, they're all pro-European, but in different ways. I suppose the one delineating factor is that they say that they're against the far right, but even that is crumbling now, not just in the EPP, which is governing with the far right, but even in the liberal camp. You have the VVD party, formerly of Mark Rutte, going into government with Geert Wilders. So I think that the socialists probably feel happy that they managed to sort of roughly maintain their score. I mean, they say that they maintained the same number of seats, but of course the parliament got bigger, so they didn't actually maintain the exact same level. But they're more isolated in the fact that they are the only people, apart from the Greens, saying that we will never, and the left, but they're not really relevant, saying that we will never govern with the far right. So, red lines are kind of dropping in other places. In terms of how the coalitions will work, yeah, the EPP is the kingmaker now. It used to be the Liberals. The Liberals are still saying that they're the kingmakers, but that's not true. In my book, I think that's a load of spin, and rather desperate spin. So, it's the fact is that there can be majorities. There are different kinds of majorities in the European Parliament. You don't always need to get the strictest form, which is, an absolute majority of all MEPs. I think that's quite rare. Normally, it's based on who shows up in the hemicycle. When it's just the group leaders who meet to discuss things where a lot of important decisions are made, the majority threshold is a bit lower. So, it's a lot of this talk about coalitions and can there be a coalition? I mean, a lot of it is influence from people who have their national parliaments thinking cap on, but it's a lot more dynamic in the European Parliament. It's a lot more ad hoc. It's about building, different coalitions on different days of the week, depending on what the weather is outside and what the legislation says. And on this point we agree, on this point we don't agree. And that's why the EPP really does have such an advantage, because they can look left, they can look right, they can, who knows, there may be things where they vote together with ID on things with the far right, just as they've done on the nature restoration law already last year. Does that mean that they're literally forming a coalition with the ID? No, but it means that they happen to vote the same way and benefit from all those votes, and they can count on them to do that. So yeah. It's quite a nuanced and complicated discussion, but I'm sure that the majority, I think, well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens as well with the vote on von der Leyen or whoever it may be, whether it's in July, whether it's in September. That will be the underpinning structure for the coalition going forward, but it doesn't mean that all votes will rely on that same coalition.
Steph, what's your view on this?
So I would just say, I think the terminology of using pro-European, it is used by, the centrist parties, but it's used by far-right parties as well. And it's very much sort of like Meloni claims that she's pro-European, and von der Leyen has said that she'll work with anyone who is pro-European. But what does this mean? And this is the problem here. I think, there is a distinction between being pro-European and being pro-EU. And these far-right parties can use pro-European because they are pro-Europe. They love the continent, but they don't necessarily like the EU. And this is the difference in terminology. So there's a lot more nuance. And so it's not very much a distinction between being pro-European and Eurosceptic. There's a very much like a more nuanced, I think, in the middle. And a lot of these centrist parties also sort of adopt sort of what might not be considered fully being pro-EU. They might support enlargement, but only for certain countries. Or like they might support aspects of the Green Deal, but not all of it. So it's very much nuanced. And I think coalitions are always problematic. And this is, national and European level. And having 27 member states, fundamentally, if you have a coalition of a lot of different parties, they're not going to agree on everything. But there is a fundamental distinction between what it means to be pro-European in the centrist parties, in theory at least, compared to what it is being pro-European on the far right side.
Yeah, Europe is what you make it. If Europe shifts more to the right, then does pro-Europe. I haven't read your paper, Stephanie. I just seeing it online, but yeah, there's no such thing. In the UK, for example, we're very used to pro-EU or anti-EU. We literally had a referendum where there were only two options on what to vote for. Whereas in the actual EU, there's different shades, right? And if Europe tilts much more to the right, then being pro-European might mean you support, putting a pause on the Green Deal, and it might mean, just might mean going with what the consensus is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best thing for the EU, or you are in favor of the current institutional makeup of the EU, or
We've talked about kind of a lot of the different political groups in the EP already, and you've already also all kind of referred to the fact that the Green group had a particularly bad election and lost quite a lot of vote share in these elections. And we actually also have a few questions about this in the Slido. And the impact that might have. Before we kind of talk about the impact on the Green Deal and policy issues, could one of you just kind of kick us off and explain a bit how the Greens did across Europe, because it's quite a varied picture as well, and why you think overall they lost seats in this election? Don't know whether anyone wants to start.
As a German, I can start to tell you that the performance of the Greens very much depends on the performance of the German Greens. So it's the biggest delegation. They had over 20 seats out of a group of 70 something. So whatever happens in Germany to the Greens is very decisive for the European Greens. And the Greens in Germany Well, I would argue that, I mean, first of all, an optimist would say, yeah, okay, but the result was so great in 2019 that it was difficult to hold. It's also true, right? We have to put it in perspective that the result that the Greens have now is still the second best they ever had. No? So it's also important to see things in perspective. But then, on German level, they became, I would say they became a little bit, the Germans are very unhappy with the government. This is the approval rates of this current government are as low as in recent history, really, and the Greens are blamed a lot for this. In a way, they're a bit the victim of their own success because many green issues were pushed, but they were pushed a little bit too hard, and people were not taken on board of this green transition sufficiently. So that is a very German issue, but it directly translates again into the health of the Greens on European level. And others can maybe talk about Greens elsewhere.
Thanks there. Does anyone want to come in on how the Greens did outside of Germany?
Just testing my knowledge here, but I think they were disappointed. I think. And I don't, that's a comforting thought maybe for the Greens that they have the second largest score ever. And it's true that we're only really comparing them to the Green Wave that happened after all the Fridays for Future, protests 5 years ago. But they would have hoped to have done better nonetheless. I mean, they feel like they did okay in the Netherlands. They feel like they did badly in Germany. I think they got a few seats. They had a bit of a disastrous campaign as well in Austria, with some media madness going on around their lead candidate there as a young Green. Didn't get any seats, I think, in Portugal. I think they picked up a kind of couple in Eastern Europe, and I think they point to that as being a great success. They'll get a few from Sumar as well in Spain. But it's kind of slim pickings. And there's a lot of German assistants to German Green MEPs who are looking for new jobs.
But in Denmark, they were coming first. No? We shouldn't not mention that. That
was a joint list, wasn't it, with the left?
Was it a joint list?
I think so. But
in the Netherlands, it was a joint list, but I'm not sure about Denmark.
Okay, the party's with the Green Left, so we'll have to do some research on that.
I think they did quite well in the Nordics in general, but I think your point, Eddy, about 2019 being a bit of a climate election, at least in Western Europe and in France and in Germany, is an important one, because it really feels, so I'm from Germany myself as well, and it really felt that in 2019 the election was very much evolved around the climate protests, and it was a year of Greta Thunberg's speech at the United Nations, the "How dare you" speech, and so it was very much on top of the agenda. And this time round, I guess it felt like the topics were more Ukraine, security and defense, competitiveness in the EU. So kind of a very different framing for this election, which might also have something to do with why the Greens did less well. I guess Sophia, did you want to come in on that?
No, indeed. I mean, if you look at Eurobarometer data, then you see that climate change is still very much on top of people's minds. But the problem is that it's just been joined by security issues, economic issues, right? And that kind of the attention is less on the Greens, or let's say the climate change is not the most pressing issue, but it's still there, and people know this. And then you see that in the Nordics and in those countries where the Greens actually did quite well. And also, these are usually member states which are economically better off. Their climate change ranges more among the top issues. And for instance, in Sweden, it's still the number one. 5 years ago, it was number one, and I think 8 or 9 member states, including Germany. And this has shifted now.
Yeah, I guess the question is, and that's also the most voted question on our Slido at the moment, what will the results mean for the future of EU environmental policy? So what will be the policy implications of a weaker Green Party, a smaller Grand Coalition, and a stronger far right? So if you think about green issues, of course, you think about the Green Deal and its implementation. And we're already hearing all sorts of kind of potential watering down from people in the EPP, but also the German FDP. So what do you think? What will be the implications for the Green Deal? Is it at risk, or how serious is the situation for green issues?
I think that there's two main areas where the EPP and the Greens are at odds, and that's the fundamental kind of crunch point where the future of the Green Deal will be kind of hammered out if they, depending on if they have talks. And there's also a split within the Greens. There's the sort of French Greens who just managed to kind of sneak in and get a few seats after running a pretty shoddy campaign. And then there's the more Dutch Greens, the Germans, who maybe, are more pragmatic. In Germany, they're in government, they're actually making tough decisions and et cetera, et cetera. So, first of all, who wins that internal struggle? Does Bas Eickhout, have, and I think the answer is yes, that he has a lot of sway in the Greens. He's probably going to become officially become one of the co-leaders of the group in the parliament. I would say that's probably inevitable now. So he apparently has a warm relationship, a good kind of personal relationship with Ursula von der Leyen. So a lot of it will come down to personal relationships. But in the two areas that I kind of identify as, the combustion engine, which is something that Manfred Weber in the EPP, the combustion engine ban in 2035, he really wants to rip that up. Obviously a huge deal for the Greens. And then agriculture as well, and that's very closely linked to environment policy. We've seen the EPP, restructuring itself under Weber as the Farmers' Party, and the Green Deal really is something which barely really touched agriculture. I mean, I covered agriculture for 3 years, and this notion in Brussels that the Green Deal was all about farmers and making things more difficult for farmers simply isn't true. I mean, there was the farm to fork strategy. There was no linkage at all, legally speaking, and that was actually down to the last German government, between the common agricultural policy, and which is a third of the EU budget, and the farm to fork strategy. The current, the last reform of the common agricultural policy was very light touch, and was basically just like, let's add in a few kind of more green things, but it just got very watered down and wasn't really that much of a radical shift at all. And it's all based on incentives, not on forcing farms to do things, really. So that's going to be the battleground. But I think in some ways the Greens have already lost the debate, because if we're now all talking about the Green Deal as if it imposes huge penalties on farmers, and we've seen all the farmers' protests. So we all think that there are all these terrible new green laws from Brussels that are raining down on farmers. But I mean, the farm to fork has actually been gutted of many of the things that they set out to do in 2020. So even that hasn't really been fully implemented.
Steph, what's your view on that kind of implications on the future of the Green Deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously you've got to look at the backdrop of these elections as being like the EPP sort of watering down the Green Deal that they, put forward in the first place. So I think obviously, in that sense, you have to question whether their motivations were, okay, we're under threat from the far right parties. Is this something that we can actually appeal to voters? And, they have managed to tie, people's economic situations with the Green Deal. And this is the problem, this perception that it costs money to, solve climate change or deal with the environmental costs of it, and I think this is something that they're going to struggle to sort of wheel back in a sense, because they've got this narrative of, okay, fine, it's going to cost money. So the Green Deal, I mean, again, sort of as Eddy was saying, it very much depends on whether the Greens need to support von der Leyen in a bid to become president again. Because obviously one of their things will be that she needs to stand by her green commitments. But, the thing is, obviously, there's a lot of Europe suffering in terms of the economy, and whether they can sort of, reverse their rhetoric around the fact that this costs money will impact whether the Green Deal can actually sort of move ahead in the same way that it was planned, or whether it is going to be watered down or changed fundamentally. And I think that's something that'll be, found out in the coming weeks and years.
There's also, just one quick thing as well that made me think, like, there's a weird sort of reversal between Berlin and Brussels, where you've got, in Berlin, the Greens are in government and the CDU is in opposition, but in Brussels it's the other way around. But they each act I mean, the Greens act in Brussels like they are in the opposition. You know, yeah, they act in Brussels like they are in the opposition. Now they have a chance to enter the government, but will they? Because, you know, and still the EPP acts, even though they've won, even though they're in power in Brussels, they often act like the opposition in Brussels. So I think, you know, German national politics bleeds a lot into the Brussels environment here, and it's about who do you know, who's going to take up their responsibilities and and really try to influence things. Maybe the Greens will think that with an election on the horizon in Germany, it's better to remain in the opposition and at least have somewhere where they're doing what they do best, which is, you know, pushing for things, opening the Overton window a bit more and saying, look at what's possible. You know, we're not only going to have to make horrible, mean choices with the Conservatives.
Yeah, Sophia, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, the Greens will be crucial for von der Leyen to avoid ECR. And now I'm not talking about, you know, ad hoc legislation making throughout the term, but for her re-election. The left side of the center-left parties have threatened to not support her if she counts on, you know, the 22, 23 seats that Meloni brings. And if she wants to not rely on those seats, because then again she jeopardizes, you know, basically the left side of the spectrum, she needs a firm commitment of the Greens, because the three parties in the middle are not enough. As we know, there's always dissidence, there's very little discipline, and so this golden number, as you said, Eddy, 361. She needs the Greens for this. And the Greens, by the way, they are quite disciplined inside their group. So if they're on board, they are a reliable partner. The problem is only that they are very unreliable in whether they are on board or not. They haven't voted for her last time, although they negotiated a Green Deal with her. So, but, you know, I think it will be, if the Greens play their card well, then this could be the pressure point. That in order to not lose, you know, more seats, more support on the left side, she makes a commitment to not count on the votes of the ECR, but then, you know, having the Greens firm on board. And this is the way that, you know, the Green Deal 2.0 could come into the agenda. That's of course not being said. I mean, there will be massive clashes with the Christian Democrat, that's for sure. But I do see the Greens having some leverage here potentially if they play it well. But they need to play ball, and they often don't.
Have we lost Jannike, I think, potentially?
Yeah, she looks very stiff to me right now.
I was just checking in case I interrupted her, that's all. So while you know, she is you know, not here at this present moment, I mean, so in terms of sort of the political parties then and the groupings, I mean, which do we think is going to be? Oh, is Jannike back?
I'm back, sorry, I just
That's all right, then Jannike, I'll let you take over again then.
I just briefly lost connection. Sorry for that. Steph, what topic did you just start discussing though, whilst I was briefly away?
I was literally, because I was just going to go on about like sort of which political groupings we think are going to be more influential in terms of sort of, you know, von der Leyen's presidency, that sort of thing. But we can go on a different thing. That was just my train of thought.
No, I think that's a good question. I mean, I did want to discuss von der Leyen's re-election, and I guess a lot of people, because the EPP actually increased its vote share, a lot of people are saying, well, that, you know, means that her chances of being re-elected have increased. Also, there are maybe no clear alternatives to her, really. So what are your views on this? Are we going to see a second von der Leyen presidency? Has the election result actually increased her chances of being re-elected?
Quick answer, yes, I would argue. Yeah. The EPP came out a bit stronger, the center holds, and Macron is weak. For me, that's in the European Council a bit of a done deal, because I don't think that they would, I can imagine that there is no, let's say, she is widely seen as, you know, a solid crisis manager. And I think within the European Council, her first term, not by everyone and on every element, but I think generally she's been, you know, widely respected for this. And so you need to come up with somebody better at this moment that then also is not a lead candidate. So then you again would also make the parliament really angry, you know, and make it even tighter for any, you know, other president to come through.
Steph, Eddy, do you agree with this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, she is like what I'm hesitant to say this because it's coming up strong and stable, which all I can think of is Theresa May, but I don't mean that. I mean, she is like the, you know, the perception of, you know, like her presidency is, you know, being this like stability, and, you know, like the likes of Ukraine, and, you know, different challenges that the EU is going to face. They need someone that's, you know, like they know, and that's going to represent stability. And I think, you know, they can't really risk someone unknown. And so I think it's very much von der Leyen, unless she says something, or, you know, like there's something fundamental that happens up until, you know, that it's decided. I think she's more than likely going to be the next president.
I guess another question is, what does this tell us about the future of the Spitzenkandidaten process? Because, of course, von der Leyen is likely to be re-elected, and kind of almost by default, because she's the incumbent and she's been the lead candidate for the EPP. That means that people can claim that the Spitzenkandidaten process is alive and kicking. But in terms of the future of the process, how kind of fit for purpose is it? And is it going to survive the 2024 European Parliament elections? Eddy, do you maybe want to start on this one?
Yeah, I don't even think it's a relevant question anymore. Not trying to be rude, but I mean, just to express how much I feel that this is so not a thing anymore. I mean, if it was really, if the Spitzenkandidat process was really, you know, really alive and kicking, you know, the socialists would be saying, no matter what, Nicola Schmidt should be, you know, getting a top job. Okay, maybe not the Commission president, but he should be council, you know, the leader of the European Council. But they're not asking for that. They're not going to ask for that. They know that would be shot down immediately. So they don't, you know, yeah, they're not even fully, you know, backing it. The only reason von der Leyen is a Spitzenkandidat, you know, is, well, there are reasons, you know, Weber really believes in the idea. He sort of pushed her into it. Maybe she needed to show that she has another side, that she has a more, you know, engaging side. So it kind of worked for her because she's seen as someone who makes, you know, decisions in small circles and doesn't talk to the media. So she had a very controlled, but did, you know, campaign, but she did travel around the continent. So it suited people to kind of pretend that it was still going on. But I mean, you know, you don't even have the support of the Liberals for this. There's no Liberal candidates. So yeah, I just think it's total fantasy.
Sophia, I know that you've written about this as well, and what is your view? Do you think it's actually dead in the water, or do you think it could be reformed, and kind of could come back in 5 years' time?
Yeah, you know, I indeed have written a lot about it, because I think, not because I necessarily think that it works so well, but because I find it fascinating from an academic point of view, you know, to take like a mechanism that we know from a national parliamentary democracy and try to apply it to the EU, and then, you know, time and time again fail, because everybody realizes then, okay, the EU is not a national state and it has a very unique institutional infrastructure and it doesn't quite fit. It is, I think, if von der Leyen becomes the next president, it is like 10 years ago with Jean-Claude Juncker, that she will be Commission president, not because, but despite the lead candidate process. It is not alive exactly by what Eddy, I subscribe to what Eddy just said, and you also see this in the fact that if the Social Democrats would get the most seats, Schmidt would never be Commission president, right? It is, however, at the same time also not completely dead, because it is happening. I mean, they are appointing the candidates, and Eddy, you're right. It becomes more and more messy around what is actually a lead candidate, right? The three Liberals indeed have said very clearly that they're not after a job in the Commission. But it is happening, and they are debating. So, you know, I think, and that is my main point of criticism. So first of all, I think what is good is that it brings a bit of transparency. 10, 15 years ago, to discuss the next Commission president and to scrutinize this person that much was inconceivable. So I think the more limelight there is, the better, yes. But the problem is that political parties, they kind of keep it alive by appointing people, but they're appointing people that are not really seriously, like, they're not attractive enough to be picked. I think this whole thing would be dissolved if the political parties would come up with candidates, and I know that it's very difficult, but come up with political heavyweights and, give those candidates, come up with candidates that the European Council can actually choose. You know what I mean? That would be, then it would be still only an option because the European Council is not bound by it, but it could be some kind of a selection process of the European Parliament, which produces, high profile, suitable people for the job. And then the European Council, could pick one of these. But yeah, the political parties they have created a bit of a monster there by, continuing, but not seriously.
But they had that last. I mean, the Parliament had its candidates last time, and they did have people. Lots of people. Rubbished Manfred Weber, but Timmermans. Was a heavyweight. Margrethe Vestager. Could have been running the commission. She's already in the commission. So,
but they did get jobs. You can argue. The good candidates did get jobs in the European Commission, and very good ones. Why was it not the lead candidate picked? Because Weber wasn't good enough. And this is exactly what I mean. The EPP Congress should not have picked Weber, but Stubb was his contender in the internal EPP Congress. He would have been the next Commission president, not Weber. Everybody knew this from the start. This is exactly my point in case. You cannot pick somebody as a party where you already know that he doesn't have executive experience and will never be picked by the European Council.
And they also already knew he wasn't going to be supported by Merkel or Macron, probably. So that makes it very difficult.
And Merkel, by the way, she was backing Timmermans, no? But she couldn't sell this within the EPP back then.
Steph, did you want to come in on the future of the Spitzenkandidaten process before we kind of use our last minutes to discuss a little bit what's been happening in France as well?
Yeah, all I would say is that, yes, it's a difficult system, but I think the one thing it does do is it does personalize these candidates, but there is probably a lot more efficient ways that could do it. And as you say, like picking people that are perceived to be more electable in these specific jobs that they're going for, but I do think it personalized them a lot more than what they would be if they were just there wasn't something there, but there is probably a more efficient way that they could do this. So.
We're going to model through in the future. It's not dead, it's not alive.
All right, well, it remains to be seen then. So I guess it's quite interesting, isn't it, to think about that actually in terms of fallout at the European level, things seem to basically happen as expected. So we expect von der Leyen to be re-elected, so no really big surprises there. But we're seeing quite unexpected fallout at the national level from these European Parliament elections. And obviously, particularly in France, where Macron decided to dissolve the Assemblée Nationale and called early legislative elections. We also had a Belgian prime minister who resigned because of the poor result of his party in the general and in the European Parliament elections. So I guess my first question to you would be, well, how do you see Macron's gamble? We also have a question in the Slido on this, which is, has Macron committed a similar mistake to that made by David Cameron? So I guess that refers to kind of Project Fear and kind of saying, well, you either vote for the status quo or, bad things will happen under Rassemblement National Prime Minister. So what's your view on what might happen in the French context, and maybe also a bit wider? What does this tell us to how do national leaders kind of see those European Parliament elections? Do they see them as a de facto referendum on their national government? Or how can we explain kind of Macron's strong reaction here? Steph, do you want to kick us off?
Mm-hmm. It is interesting, isn't it, to see that he's reacted purely on these results. And it's sort of like heightened the importance of the results in France. And where you would, you know, there's a lot of perception that like European elections in general for voters are second order, so there's less at stake at this sense. But Macron's really sort of tried to address the fact that actually the concerns raised at the European level are the same on the national level. But I think, you know, like the important point here is that, you know, like the electoral systems at the European level are different. And so, you know, as Scholz mentioned, you know, he wasn't going to hold an election because the electoral system in France is different to that of Germany. You know, so like there's potentially less risk in France for the National Rally to do well. However, you know, like they're still going to gain seats, just not necessarily a majority in the parliament that they would, you know, like, you know, that would really, you know, impact Macron. But I do think it's interesting that they have Macron in particular has sort of raised the level of the importance of the European elections to something, you know, like he's now basing that on, okay, fine, you know, what does the public actually want at a national level? And I think it's a very interesting, you know, thing, but it's not something that's like across the board. You know, so France is a particular interesting case, but obviously this is the backdrop of National Rally doing well in the polls anyway. So yeah.
Eddy, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think everyone was surprised, shocked even that Macron kind of made this decision, and you know the Rassemblement National always wins. You know, for the last few times, you know, it's normal that they beat Macron. So shouldn't really be such a surprise. It was maybe more the way that they won, the kind of the fact they got more than double the score. But I think the real danger for Macron is that now that the two sides of the political spectrum are coalescing, you know, already in the National Assembly he's pretty weak, and you know, he's, instead of being the kind of center of gravity where everyone is forced to kind of unite around him from the sort of center left and center right, he's starting to become someone isolated in the middle where everyone and the center of gravity moves to the two other sides. So, you know, I think it really was a huge risk, and you know, maybe one that could totally, you know, blow up in his face.
Sophia, what's your view on this? You could also comment if you want on the fallout in Germany, because I know that's where you're from as well, and I guess the coalition there, as you already said, is very unpopular, and the result isn't very positive for Scholz's coalition. We have more state elections coming in the autumn in Germany as well. So I would feel also free to talk a bit about the domestic fallout in Germany.
Sure. So first of all, I think your colleagues, Eddy in the Playbook, wrote it that is it a Sanchez or a Cameron move, right? And I think this is exactly what it is. Is it either or? I still don't quite understand what the rationale is here. I mean, is he seriously thinking that he could gain more seats and leave the minority government? I mean, it seems to me, I don't know French domestic politics too well, but it seems to me, you know, quite a risky move if this was his goal. Or is it about, you know, letting them govern and disenchant, you know, which we know from other countries that this is equally risky, right? But in a way, you know, your question also, Jannike, on the two levels, in a way, he drew the right conclusions, because French voters did not vote on EU issues. They voted particularly on this, on him and his government. And this was a referendum on his performance as a president, as we see across the EU. I mean, this is very much still, you know, second order national elections, in the sense that in all EU countries, especially in those where the government is unpopular at the moment, this has been seen as a referendum. And it's also been, you know, played by the political parties like this. If you look at, you know, how the campaigns were organized, and you see that it's very much around national issues and national people. In Germany, what I found really, in a way, shocking, and then again not surprising at all, is if you looked at the election posters, then you saw Ursula von der Leyen, by the way, coming very late, only like a week or two before the elections, on the election posters at all. she was lacking before. And then she was there together with the leader of the CDU, Friedrich Merz. And on the other side, on the Social Democrats, the lead candidate, Katharina Barley, who in Germany is very well known because she's been a minister, she was also on there with Olaf Scholz. Both men are not running for elections, so political parties do this purposefully to keep things domestic, because then they get more votes. So in a way, about this. One more sentence about Germany. Yes, I know. I mean, there are people like, the Bavarian Prime Minister Markus Söder, who now calls for snap election. But I mean, Olaf Scholz is not half as dramatic and as Macron. So to be honest, I don't see it for now. Let's see. But I think the situation is changing every day.
Thank you, Sophia. And I think that's all we have time for today. That concludes our lunch hour for today. I just want to say thank you very much to all three of our panelists for your insights. And we will continue to monitor the fallout from the European Parliament elections very closely. Also, thank you to our audience and all those who sent in questions on the Slido. Apologies if we couldn't get to all of those. But yeah, do watch out for any content on the UK and the Changing Europe website on the European Parliament elections in the coming days as well. And thanks again to Eddy, Sophia and Steph, and have a lovely rest.